race is on, and after Charles Leclerc crashed out of the lead of the French Grand Prix, Max Verstappen claimed his 7th victory of the season. But what would have happened had their battle played out? And just how big a mistake did Leclerc make? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to answer those questions and many more are Scott, Mitchell and Mark Hughes. Well, Mark, we'll come to you first. How's things with you now?
Yes, I'm feeling okay today. Thank you very much. Dreaded COVID lurgy since the last race, but yeah, okay now. Thank you. Thank you for asking.
All our listeners care, of course. We've all had it in quick succession, so it's a hat trick between the three of us. And Scott Mitchell joining me in France. Have you been enjoying the sunshine?
Yeah. It's been absolutely baking, like it is in most of Europe, I suppose. Really roasting. There was, I think the best example of it was just how much it was playing havoc with the FIA's track thermometers, because just in the build-up before the race, the track temperature it leapt from about 50 to 67 degrees, then fell to 61, and then settled, I think, in sort of mid to low 50s or something like that. So depending on whether the sunshine got particularly bright, I think it was tricking a few thermometers. But yeah, it's been a very, very hot few days in France, but it's been pretty enjoyable.
Even hotter in the Hungaroring for next weekend, it seems. That's something to look forward to. But there's loads to talk about in this race, so let's get straight into it. And Scott, we're going to start off with the obvious topic, which was Charles Leclerc's crash at the fast Le Beausset right-hander while leading on the 18th lap of the race. What went wrong?
Well, it was in a I want to say delicate phase of the Grand Prix. There wasn't a huge amount at stake, I don't think, in that specific moment, because Max Verstappen had just made his pit stop. He was going to undercut Leclerc. There was nothing Leclerc could do at that point to retain the lead, but it was obviously a point of sensitivity because he's got to try and minimise the damage as much as possible. And it just looked like he carried a bit too much speed into Beausset, and I don't know if he dropped the outside the left rear onto the runoff or dirty part of track or something, but it just looked like the rear started to step out as he tipped it in a little bit more, and once that went, Leclerc is normally so good, fast hand Charles is normally able to just get hold of that situation, but he couldn't. The car went round, did a neat 360, but unfortunately the speed and the trajectory meant that he was arrowing towards the barrier. It wasn't the biggest impact in the world, but whether it was something that just broke something on the car and stopped it being able to revert, provide enough torque to be able to reverse out, or it got genuinely stuck at the front. I don't think it was that. I think it was just the car would then not really move under its own steam properly afterwards, but he was stuck. He said that the damage didn't look that severe, so he thought he'd be able to get it out and get back going again. And once he got out of the car, when that failed, and he looked at it, I think he was particularly gutted, because I don't think he felt he'd written the car off and wanted to rejoin the race, but sadly wasn't to be.
And Mark, we've talked about Charles Leclerc mistakes quite a bit over the past few years. They're not constant, but there is a steady trickle of them, isn't there? So how did you see this one?
Yeah, I mean, his style is full attack, and it does invite the occasional incident. And yeah, as Scott was just saying, you saw the left rear just get onto that white line, a white painted line, and the speed that you're doing there, if you get the rear out, it's not coming back. And he'd even made mention of it before the race. He'd said, although he likes an oversteering car, he wasn't able to play with it so much here, because he said the corners are all such high speed, and you destroy the tyres if you let it oversteer too much. And he said, and also, if you get an oversteer moment, it's at such high speed and it's such high lateral G that you're not going to catch it. And he didn't. And that particular corner was probably the absolute core of the car's advantage this weekend. It was 15 kilometers faster through there than the Red Bull. And it was just absolutely dynamite through there. But it does leave you, especially the line, they were a very aggressive late turn-in line that they're able to take. But it took you way out wide, and it took you perilously close to that to the painted line, and I think it was just a combination. He was, I think it caught him by surprise. He was, he sort of got into his own rhythm throughout the weekend, and eventually it bit him. And it's as I say, he's an attacking driver. He will always try to solve any problems by attacking harder. And it might just be just a trait. You might look at it as a fault, but I'm more inclined to look at it as just another part and parcel of the same thing that gives them the amazing speed. So yeah, I don't think it's something that is experience. I think he has enough experience now to be able to understand what he needs to do. I just think that's his style, and it does bite occasionally.
I'll have to say, you've been slightly more generous to Leclerc than Leclerc was to himself after that crash, but he is famously intolerant of his own errors and always very, very happy to admit to the mistake. And of course, he firmly put the blame on himself. But Scott, I noticed your version of Leclerc's crash made no mention of the fact that it was really caused by his throttle sticking open.
Yeah, my mistake. I forgot to factor in the theories that came in. The floodgates really opened basically the second Leclerc stopped and got out of his car. I was surprised to hear actually that these theories ended up permeating some of the TV coverage as well, just purely because to me it just seemed so obvious that there was no foul play here and there was no cover up. But just to provide a bit of context and explain what you've referenced there, Ed, there was this suggestion that was born from a comment Leclerc made over the radio, and it's still not 100% clear exactly what it said, but what it was widely reported as was him saying, I can't get off throttle. This was once he was in the barrier. And it led to a suggestion that was very, very keenly picked up on by whether it's anti-Ferrari people or just pro-Leclerc people, that he'd had a recurrence of the throttle problem that emerged late in the Austrian Grand Prix, and that the throttle had stuck open slightly and caused the crash. But there's no evidence to suggest that. In fact, all the evidence from that incident, what Leclerc said over the radio, what he tried to do in the car, points to it being just a complete mistake. What I think Leclerc actually said was, I can't get on throttle. I think that's what he said. And what I think that's a reference to was that then once he was in the barrier and trying to reverse out, I think he wasn't able to get the car to move on throttle. And it was about, and I asked Mattia Binotto this from Ferrari, and I know people will say that this is just Binotto covering the team, but the explanation is very simple, that he just couldn't get the car moving, basically. So these theories, they just don't hold water, to be honest. There was a throttle problem, so there was a sticking component in Austria, which the team identified, and they put action in place to make sure it can't happen again. Leclerc didn't indicate any kind of mechanical issue. The comment that he made when he was in the barrier had nothing to do with anything that caused the accident. It was all to do with the fact that he was trying to get out. He even turned the car off and turned it on again. Such was the difficulty he had in, getting it properly. The only thing that was slightly weird about it was that there is a moment, we heard it on the world feed, where his engineer comes back at him and says something along the lines of, it's at 0% now. And that just precedes the Leclerc scream that was one of the defining moments of the Grand Prix and the coverage. And the reason that's weird is not necessarily because he said it's at 0%. That could easily be just a reference to, yes, your throttle is at 0%, because he may have misunderstood Leclerc's original message or something. What's slightly odd is that exchange actually doesn't exist on the F1 TV onboard footage from Leclerc's car. And normally, if the car's running and switched on, that is a completely open channel. You hear everything that Leclerc, when he turns the radio on, tells the team, and you hear everything the team tells back directly to him. But it's very weird. There is a few seconds that cut out, and I don't know if it's to do with the fact that Leclerc turned the car off in the middle of all this, but it's impossible to find. It was for me anyway. I don't know if it is there and I've just missed it, but I listened back like 5 or 6 times and can't find that particular bit from the world feed. That's the only weird thing, but it's a minor oddity and it absolutely doesn't play into the conspiracy theories at all. So how many times on this podcast have we sat here and criticised Ferrari for getting various things wrong? We've sledged them for their reliability. We've questioned their strategic choices. We've criticised them for the way they've handled Leclerc and Sainz sometimes in that team orders dynamic. I'm not about to sit here and defend them if I think they've made a genuine mechanical error, but I think that's just nonsense. And I think the fact that Leclerc took the blame was just because he knew it was a mistake, not because he was rushing to defend the team or told to cover anything up.
Yeah, and Charles Leclerc is not afraid to express himself if he's a bit unhappy with the team or he thinks there's been a problem. So I think we can take him at his word there. Now, Mark, as always, we're taking questions from the Race Members Club on our Race Review podcast. For more information on the Race Members Club, head to therace.com and don't forget the hyphen and click on Join the Race. But our first question comes from Chris Parrott, and you've already touched on this a little bit, Mark. But he says, Leclerc clearly has the speed to be world champion, but mistakes are crippling his chances of realising that potential. How much time will Ferrari give him to get on top of these errors? Are there any comparisons to be drawn between them and the latter days of Vettel's Ferrari career, which was also error-strewn? Is there anything about Ferrari that puts drivers under added pressure and forces these mistakes?
I don't see the parallels with Vettel's latter days at Ferrari, when he was not undermined but not being supported fully, and had there was an undercurrent of dissatisfaction there, and he felt it and didn't feel supported by the team, and I think it ended up a bit of a vicious circle. By contrast, Leclerc is absolutely 100% the blue-eyed boy at Ferrari, and they will continue to support him because he's such a brilliant driver, and it's who they have staked their future on. If you look at the superstars of this generation, he's one, Max Verstappen's one, and then we've got potential of Lando Norris, George Russell coming along. Ferrari have said this is our guy, so that's not going to change. As for errors creeping in, I touched on it before. I think it's two sides of the same coin. I think the searing speed we see from him, I think, is part of a style which is an oversteery style, and which can bring fantastic speed, but which makes you inherently vulnerable to something going a little bit wrong, and you just small mistake becoming a big one. And I think it's just a trait, and it's something that if you see it in the round, I think certainly if I was a team owner, I'd happily live with it.
Yeah, exactly. You take the positives and the negatives, but we do see a trend with drivers of this type that as time goes on, they do balance up the risk reward a little bit better sometimes. So the question is with Leclerc whether he can just smooth out those slightly jagged edges while still maintaining his pace. That'd be something he's working on. He talked about the need to do that. So I think we'll see him learning from it. But obviously that's 2 in-race errors he's made this year, Imola being the other one when he hit the wall at the chicane, did manage to get out of it and finish, but cost himself some points there as well. So that's the interesting challenge for Leclerc. Scott, a question for you from Bram Kuhneman, whose question is, the downfall of Ferrari's championship run seemed to be the reliability of the power unit not being good enough. But will this mistake by Leclerc, followed by the heartbreaking, no, don't think I've done that justice, on the radio, be remembered for being the final nail in the coffin?
I think halfway through the season's a bit too early, to be the final nail in the coffin. But I think it could come to be one of the... I think it could come to be the defining image of Leclerc's season, much like you remember, obviously Vettel at was it Hockenheim in 2018. That is, I think, fair to say that's the symbolic moment of Vettel's season unravelling, isn't it? In 2018, but as you guys are going to remember, like there were plenty of errors after that. there were a few more nails got hammered into Vettel's coffin in 2018 with his title bid, and it could well be the same with Leclerc. I don't think this is the last we'll hear of strategy problems or reliability or mistakes, that kind of thing. So I think there will be more to come in that regard, but I think this will be quite defining for two reasons. One, it's Leclerc crashing out of the lead, which is a very rare thing to see in general, let alone from him. And two, because of that anguished noise, there's an audible element to it. I don't know if a noise can have symbolic value, but it very much does in this case.
And if you want to get mathematical about it, it's a 25-point swing in Verstappen's favour. So those are the ones we always look at, the moments where there's a big points gain from one title protagonist over the other. Well, Mark, normally we ask you to explain how the race was won, but I think given it was quite straightforward for Verstappen once Leclerc was out of the way, let's make it a bit more hypothetical and ask how it might have played out without Leclerc's crash.
It would have been fascinating, and there isn't an obvious clear answer. But I mean, both sides were claiming that they think they would have won. Leclerc was, pretty confident he'd thrown 25 points away, and Christian Horner was saying, no, we had them on the ropes. We'd undercut them, and we were going to have position. So yes, they'd brought Max in very early, as soon as there was a gap to drop him into, because his tyres were beginning to wilt, because he'd spent so long in the DRS zone of Leclerc. And I think they'd been thinking if they could push Leclerc hard enough, his tyres would wilt. And actually, the Ferrari's tyres were standing up okay. There's a little bit of graining going on the right front, which tends to happen. It gets dragged across the surface with the camber. But nothing that was really impacting on its performance at that point, and it was the Red Bull's tyres which wilted first. Therefore, they brought them in early. But they had been surprised, because Red Bull had got into this race thinking it was probably going to be a two-stop. They'd been surprised at how well the tyres had held up and how they weren't actually overheating as they would expect them to, despite the track temperature and despite running hard up into Leclerc's DRS zone. So they were thinking, no, we'll just do an undercut as soon as we can, and we should still be able to do a one-stop, because if the mediums have lasted this long, sat behind another car, the hards will easily get us to the end, and we'll have track position. So once Red Bull had made that stop, there was no point in Ferrari responding the next lap. They'd already lost the position then. So what they were going to do was run long, just until the tyres had given up, basically. And the nominal lap that they were targeting was lap 22. So that would have given them 6-lap tyre offset. So he would have come back out close, still quite close behind, with no threat from third place, and on tyres 6 laps newer, and with a lot of the race still to go. So it would have been very, very interesting. I couldn't even hazard a guess as to how it would have turned out, but it would have been very, very close.
Yeah, we don't have quite enough to go on to know exactly what would have happened, but I guess we got a bit of a sneak preview in the first stint of how difficult overtaking was. It's difficult to see a Ferrari passing a Red Bull if that was the way it needed to go, even with a healthy tyre offset. Yeah,
that's true. And we saw that even though the Red Bull was faster on the straights, it couldn't get close enough through the preceding corners onto the Mistral turns 5 and 6, because the Ferrari was so much quicker through there. So, that they never got in position. But maybe, maybe would have been able to see something like the move that Sainz managed to pull on Perez, maybe in an unusual part of the track. There's no way of knowing.
Well, Carlos Sainz came into this weekend knowing he'd be starting from the back row thanks to power unit component changes, but he recovered to 5th. However, he'd just taken 3rd place from Perez when he came in to change from the mediums he'd taken under the early safety car to another set of hards with 11 laps to go. So as Danny Elliott asks us, what is it with Ferrari strategy? What did you make of this one, Mark?
It looks on the surface a very defeatist way of going about it. They were in no man's land for that medium tyre. They'd gone way too long to make it a 2-stop. So they'd all more or less, committed to that that set of tyres, and then very late in the day, far too late to be able to do anything about it, they figured that he wouldn't have enough tyre left to pull out the 5-second penalty because he'd been penalised 5 seconds for an unsafe release of the pit lane, that he wouldn't have enough tyre left to pull out 5 seconds over Perez and Russell, and that he would therefore finish an official P5. So rather than P5, they figured, well, let's bring him in, let's get rid of the tyre risk, and we'll finish P5 and we'll get a point for fastest lap because we'll be on new tyres. So that's what they did. That's their justification for it. I would have given that he just pulled that move on Perez. I would have been much more inclined to let him have his head and let's just see if we could pull 5 seconds out. And if he failed, he failed.
Yeah, the downside isn't too bad. If you have to abort that, you get the fastest lap probably anyway. And we should say that Pierre Gasly did go onto mediums at the same time under that early safety car and got to the end. Okay, different cars, different race situations. So the tyre behaviour and life is not directly comparable from one car to another, but it does show it was in principle at least possible. Scott, Sainz was genuinely quick at Paul Ricard. So can we now definitively say he turned a corner after those early struggles with the Ferrari F175?
Well, I think he's happy with where he's got to now with this car. I spoke to him about this a couple of times through the weekend, and he said that since Barcelona, which he considers his low point in the season, he really feels like he's just been gradually building something now from Monaco onwards. I feel like Sainz is guessing a little bit less now in terms of where the limit of this car is. Mark was talking earlier about the way Leclerc basically slides the car and manipulates it and has it on the edge, and he's quite aggressive. I have a feeling that the way the 2022 Ferrari plays really nicely to the way Leclerc wants to drive a car. And I just feel like early in the season, Sainz was often getting caught out by where that limit was. How many times did he... I think... I'm thinking the qualifying crash at Imola, and then his off in Australia and the spin in Spain, where afterwards, every time, do you remember he said that he didn't understand what had gone wrong? He just, I know that pretty much every spin catches out every driver, otherwise they wouldn't spin, but Sainz genuinely didn't seem to understand how it had happened. And I just get the feeling now because we know how intelligent he is, we know how much of a hard worker he is, he's a great driver and he has got good feel. I get the feeling he's now got a much better idea of where that car is and just he can take it to the limit and stay at the limit or stay on the limit and do so knowing that he's there, if that makes any sense at all. He's not going to... It doesn't feel like he's going to accidentally meander over the line now, which I feel like is what he was doing at the start of the season. So what that means is he's now much more consistently close to Leclerc or on Leclerc's pace over one lap. He was very, very happy with his Q2 lap this weekend, which obviously amounted to nothing in the grand scheme of things because he had a back of the grid penalty, so he didn't take part in Q3 properly. He just existed to give Leclerc a tow. But I think he can also then drive the car harder in the race, because I think he can just hang on a bit more when the tyres start to go off. He's not panicking as much. So that's partly natural evolution. I think, a bit more track time with the car, just getting a bit happier with it. And it's partly, I just think, him chipping away at it, understanding, right, what can the car get away with? What is it that sets it off? What is it that tips it over into something uncontrollable? And the net result is what we're seeing, which is this really good run of form that leaves Sainz in a position where he's not just going to be sort of like a distant number two to Leclerc over the rest of the season. I have a feeling he's going to be a very, very powerful weapon for Ferrari race to race, even if their championship bids lie in tatters somewhat.
The thing that's great about Sainz is you always feel there's a direction of travel for him, by which I mean he doesn't just keep going and hope it'll sort itself out. He works at it. He tries to get on top of it. He pushes himself. He improves himself. And you always thought you'd come back at some point. It was a question of how long. And I think it's to his credit that he's been able to weather that early part of the season and bring himself back into it. It's just this sort of thing that he is kind of there to be the number 2 as far as the team's concerned, but he just keeps making it a little bit more complicated than that. And yeah, well done to him for putting that work in and actually getting something out of it rather than just blaming the car endlessly. Mark, Leclerc's now 63 points behind Verstappen in the drivers' standings and Ferrari's 82 behind Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship, which brings us to a question from Thomas Knight, who says, another weekend where the Ferrari was arguably the fastest car, but the result was not maximised. The more the season goes on, the slicker Mercedes and Red Bull operations are really showing up Ferrari at the moment. Fair assessment or harsh on the Scuderia?
Harsh but fair. I think yes, this weekend we've had a driver error. Previous weekends we've had power unit failures. Previous weekends to that we've had strategy errors. You put a championship campaign together and it incorporates all of those things. And Red Bull are super, super sharp and have a car comparably fast to Ferraris, and they just put it together and they win races where they're not even the fastest. There's several of Max's 7 wins this year where he hasn't been the fastest, but he and the team together have produced the result. And yeah, that's what you're up against as Ferrari trying to win a championship. That's the caliber of the competition, and it's no good saying that we're potentially better than them or we're faster than them or we can beat them on a good day. That's not going to win you a championship. So yeah, that's absolutely that summary that the listener gave, I think, is absolutely spot on.
It feels almost like one of those seasons for Ferrari where they're in this recovery, they've got the pace in the car now, and maybe they need to go through a few battle scars to be kind of cured in the heat of battle. But of course, that does presuppose the fact that they learn from all these problems and they emerge next year as a much more cohesive fighting unit. So that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I appreciate the point of view I think you're trying to play, not devil's advocate there, Ed, but I think you're trying to maybe see things through with a glass half full for Ferrari. But I said this on, I can't remember when, but probably a couple of podcasts ago. It's not like Ferrari has re-emerged from, a decade in the abyss or something like that. They were trying to win titles just 4 years ago. And, well, even in 2019, I think we can include 2019 in that. It was only really 2 seasons that they spent out of the picture. They haven't been good enough for a really, really long time. And the longer this goes on, the more they find ways to make mistakes. The unconvincing way they went about it with Sainz and his strategy yet again this weekend. I know they feel they're being ganged up on strategy and this kind of thing, but I just don't think they're up to the required standard. I don't think they have been for a while. And I don't think there is a really confident culture in that team. Do you remember a few years ago when Maurizio Ribene was there and he gave that really, really vague statement? It was in Abu Dhabi, I think, at the end of 2018, where he just said, we need to learn how to have a winning culture, or we need to learn how to be a winning team, or something like that. And it was just like, what does that mean? That's just so vague. But actually now I kind of feel like, yeah, I don't think this team knows how to win over the course of a season. They're just whether they second guess themselves, they play things conservatively, whatever it is. Obviously, their lead driver putting it in the barriers when he's leading the Grand Prix doesn't help. It just feels like every single part of this organisation just isn't at the required standard yet, and that could come. But I just have a little bit of a doubt that it will, because it hasn't. Like, they haven't learned from the most recent failings, which were only a few years ago. So maybe it will come, but I'm a bit worried that even if they get better as an organisation, I really struggle to think that they'll have as competitive a car next year as they do this year. Because Mercedes isn't in the picture this year. Red Bull's got this front end limitation that's holding them back, and the car's a bit overweight. I just feel like this is a great opportunity for Ferrari, that they haven't completely thrown it away yet, but they've done most of the hard work in throwing it away, haven't they? Because it's a long way back from here.
Yeah, the team has just not made the most of the car. That was mentioned in the question. And for any team to have this sort of strike rate of points scored versus points they should have got, it's never going to result in a good outcome. So that's what they really need to work on. And you mentioned culture, and I guess it depends on a team that internally needs to be really brutally frank with itself and accept and understand those failings, and the culture comes in. It's not a full-on blame culture, as in it's whoever's fault, get rid of them. It's really, really tackling the problem, and that means they might start to get somewhere, but a long road ahead for Ferrari in that regard. More on the French Grand Prix in a moment, but first it's time to check in on the race's Grid Rival League. Grid Rival is a fancy motorsport game that offers you the chance to pick a team of 5 drivers and 1 constructor, but with the added challenge of juggling the length of time they remain in your roster and how best to spend your limited budget. I managed 986 points this week with my all-new lineup. Sadly, I couldn't get Verstappen or Leclerc. Well, I say sadly on Leclerc, but he wouldn't have paid big points. But I was locked out of them. I would have had them, I would imagine, if they weren't. So I couldn't get them into my team. So I went with Sergio Perez, Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly. Not a bad performance, but Gasly was my double points driver. 12th place, not ideal. And in my defence, I made that decision on Friday, which was much more promising and positive. So 986 points enough for victory over you, Scott?
Yes, it is actually. It was a slightly poor week for me. I think I cleared 900 points quite comfortably, but it just wasn't a particularly effective one. I lost out because I had Alex Albon as my double points driver, and he didn't make as much of an impact as I thought he would. I also had Kevin Magnussen in my team, so obviously didn't get a huge amount of points from him. I scored big with Max Verstappen, Fernando Alonso, and Lando Norris, and Alpine was my constructor, so that did well. But yeah, really let down by Magnussen's DNF and Alex Albon as my talent driver.
Well, still in the overall lead is Jackie 78958103 with an outrageous 12,165 points and a team containing Verstappen and both Mercedes drivers. So a clean sweep of the podium for them, backed up by Alonso and Ricciardo, who are both in the points. So well done for some inspired choices there. We'll keep following progress over the year of this league, so download the Grid Rival app or visit the website so you can join in. You'll find the link in the episode description for this podcast. Mark, back to you. Mercedes had its best result of the year with Lewis Hamilton second and George Russell third. Hamilton was only 10.5 seconds behind Verstappen at the finish, so that's a strong performance from Mercedes after its difficult time in qualifying. Simon T asks, do Mercedes have an idea of what's gone on this weekend and why the upgrades didn't seem to produce the expected results? And of course, this question is partly referring to how positive Mercedes were about their chances for Paul Ricard.
Yeah, I think actually overall, considering this was expected to be a track format that really suited the car anyway, I think they were hoping to be a bit closer than they were, although they got a result. That's a very circumstantial result. You know, we got Sainz starting from the back, we got Perez off the pace, and we got Leclerc crashing. So it's not second and third, but it's very much an attrition-aided second and third. And although Lewis was only 10 seconds behind at the end, that was, Verstappen just cruising, keeping his tyres in shape, not needing to do any more than that. They were 9/10 off in qualifying. They were maybe 6/10 off in the race. So that's although the car's behaving in a sanitary way, it's the bouncing is under control. They can sort of, drive it more confidently than earlier in the season. Its outright raw performance is as far off the front really as its average so far in the season. So no, I don't think that they've got what they were expecting from the car this weekend, despite the good result.
They probably need to stop tricking themselves into thinking they know exactly what's going on with it. The direction is good, but yeah, still a long way to go for them. But Scott, Lewis Hamilton, how's he responding to the upturn in form, I think we can call it? They're not a race-winning car yet, but how is he taking on this challenge?
I think very well. I've thought for a few races now, actually, that Hamilton has been very positive. He obviously had that bad run for a decent chunk of the season after the podium in Bahrain, where weekends were a bit messy, the results weren't there. There was that odd run of Russell either out qualifying or out racing him or both for quite a few races. But through that time, I honestly never got the impression that Hamilton's head was dipping. I didn't buy into the idea that he was underperforming or that he was phoning it in. In fact, often saw and heard a driver that was working very, very hard and, taking on the lion's share of experiment work and that kind of thing, and was very dedicated to the cause, because Hamilton's off-track work ethic, I think, has always been chronically underrated, especially as he's won all these titles. So we've just had this switch of circumstances the last few races where Hamilton's had a bit more of the fortune, perhaps. He's had the cleaner weekends. He's had races where he hasn't made mistakes or got involved in incidents, and it's him rather than Russell who's picked up the bigger results, and he's been there rather than Russell to inherit better positions when something's happened to a Red Bull or a Ferrari. And through all of that, still that off-track demeanour and work ethic remains incredibly strong. And he was talking this weekend about enjoying the situation in Formula One more than ever, and I don't think it was lip service. I think it was sincere, to the point where I have a feeling that a driver who I was 90% sure would be walking away from F1 at the end of next season, the end of 2023, I really wouldn't be surprised if there's an extension, not necessarily coming in the next few months, but I wouldn't be surprised if he does a new deal to stay to the end of 2024 at the earliest, because he's still performing at a very, very high level. He's doing a lot of work to rectify the team situation. He's given as much feedback as possible. He's still taking on loads of experimental work. I think in France he tried all the different rear wings that were available, including a massive one that he said was like having a parachute attached to the back, going down the back straights. So I have a feeling that he is very, very, very committed to the cause of restoring Mercedes to race-winning ways. And the more they chip away at it, the more I think he believes that it is actually a realistic aim. And they're so far behind at the moment, and with so much to do, 2023 might come a bit too soon for them to really win and fight for a championship again. So, why not go into 2024 and make this, reap the rewards of the effort that's being put in. So that's where I honestly think this is heading. And I think it's just a testament to not only the level that he's driving at, but also the place he's in mentally and how committed to this project he still is.
Yeah, it's one of those quirks of the way these things work out, that the difficult year this year might actually mean his F1 career is extended beyond where it would have been had he had a championship winning car again this year, but time will tell on that. But yeah, I can see exactly where you're coming from in terms of whether he's still going to be around in 2024. It's certainly possible. Mark, let's talk about Lewis Hamilton's teammate George Russell. He wasn't on the same sort of pace as Hamilton, but he nicked third place from Sergio Perez at the late VSC restart, jumping in when the green flag was thrown with 3 laps remaining. What did you make of that?
It was partly, it was very smart of George. He sort of had that run of momentum on Perez, as Perez was anxiously trying not to get under the VSC sector time. But there was a bit of a backdrop to that, and there'd been some technical difficulties in race control, and it had to do a reset. And when they did that, for some reason, the display in Perez's car didn't come up with the target time. So he wasn't sure where he was, hence his caution. And it was just George had played it perfectly by backing off a bit earlier and then having the advantage of momentum just as the green flag came out, if you like. It's sort of like Anthony Davidson described it as like cruising up to the lights in anticipation of them going green, and they go green as you're still moving. It was a bit like that. So yeah, a very, very good move, but Perez was also compromised a little by circumstances.
Yeah, he's very unhappy with it. The problem is the VSC system had some kind of hardware problem, and basically it had already launched the instruction that the VSC would be ending, and that means you have a 10 to 15 second countdown. So that countdown had begun, but then they had the hardware problem, and it automatically switches to the backup VSC hardware, but that's a completely different system. So the previous one was sort of lost. It couldn't just pick up that countdown, so it had to reissue that instruction of the VSC is going to end shortly and then begin a new countdown. So it added up to about a minute later it restarted. But yeah, obviously the FIA, when I asked them about it, did say they didn't have any reports about any information problems in terms of the flow of information from FIA to the team. So all the deltas should have been there. And they also had the trackside boards as well, giving the countdown. So there was some information available to Perez, but exactly how much is a bit unclear. But ultimately, he didn't deal with it perhaps as well as he should have done. Scott, there was an earlier incident between the two of them when Russell dived up the inside of the chicane and Perez was forced to cut the track. No action taken on that one. Did that surprise you in any way?
No, not really, because Perez was able to continue. So yeah, Perez obviously got you would argue that Perez got forced off the track, I suppose, but he stayed ahead. So I guess it was kind of considered no harm, no foul, crack on. In terms of what would have happened had that not happened and Perez been spun, it's very difficult to say. But the fact Perez wasn't ordered to give the place to Russell suggests that they didn't think Perez was at fault or did anything wrong. So if Perez had been spun out by that incident, I think Russell would have got a penalty. He was very, very unhappy and complained quite a bit over the radio, because he felt he'd got far enough alongside Perez that the corner was his. And we know that the positioning of cars in battle has become such a sore point this season with the new guidelines in place. And it's honestly quite hard to judge in this situation. One of the things we talked about before is that these racing rules, they do encourage dive bombs like we saw Russell pull on Perez, because it's all about whether you can get near enough alongside basically by the apex and keep your car on track. And Russell did both those things. He seemed to think that he only needed to have his front wheels by Perez's rear wheels, which is a bit questionable as to whether that is the case, but who knows how the stewards interpret what is fairly woolly wording. But he was significantly alongside. He did make the corner, so I can see why Russell sort of thought he had a case. I think it was fair enough to chalk it up as a racing incident. I like it when incidents like this don't result in a penalty and it's basically wave play on. So in the end, Russell had to find another way past, and the way he found the way he found a way past Perez was quite inventive. So in the end, I think he'll probably think that this was calmer in a way, that the situation righted itself. But I didn't have a massive problem with how it was handled in the end.
And of course, the big talking point, these rules of engagement on track and the guidelines. The drivers, in the drivers' briefing on Friday, went through some examples of various penalties, not just these sorts of incidents, but the track limits ones as well. And so that dialogue is ongoing. They're hoping to get a slightly better understanding, and maybe also they'll accept that if they do call for rules to be in place, they will be consistently applied accordingly. Well, Mark, Fernando Alonso took 6th for Alpine behind Sainz, with Lando Norris 7th ahead of Esteban Ocon and Daniel Ricciardo. So that battle on track mirrored the Constructors' Championship fight for 4th with Alpine and McLaren. But on race day, Alpine did seem stronger, having been beaten in qualifying. McLaren had that major upgrade package here. So what do we learn about the balance of power between these two teams?
Yeah, I think McLaren felt that the upgrade had worked. It was quicker as a quicker car than it had been, and Lando qualified it very well in between the two Mercs. But that car still retains the same trait. It puts its energy in the tyres very, very efficient, very well. So any place where cars are struggling to get first lap tyre temperature, which there were here, surprisingly, the McLaren looks good because it looks good in qualifying because it can put that energy into the tyres. But that's a disadvantage very often on race day. So it's the opposite to the Mercedes, if you like. The Mercedes can't put the energy into the tyre quickly enough over one lap, but is very good with the tyres over a race stint. The McLaren's the opposite. And yeah, the Alpine looks a more consistent car. It wasn't as quick over a lap, but it was, I looked to have a fairly handy edge in the race, and we saw it not just with the Lando Norris, Fernando Alonso battle, but we also saw it with Daniel Ricciardo, Esteban Ocon.
Yeah, and of course, Alonso had a relatively straightforward race after a strong first lap to get that 6th place. Ocon had to pass Ricciardo because he got that penalty. So, Scott, That 5-second penalty Ocon got for contact with Tsunoda on the first lap, was that a fair call from stewards or another one of these inconsistencies we're always hearing them complain about?
No, I think it was fair. It was a very minor error in terms of what Ocon did. He tried to just sort of he tried to hold it tight but tough it out on the inside, but he got too close to the curb. He got a wiggle on, and he absolutely clouted Tsunoda. It wasn't like he just run him off road slightly or just gained a position. He absolutely belted the AlphaTauri and ruined Tsunoda's Grand Prix. So I think in that situation, a 5-second penalty is absolutely justified, and I suspect Tsunoda didn't think it was particularly harsh enough, because ultimately, while his Grand Prix was absolutely ruined, Ocon's, barely, it didn't really even affect his final result, did it?
Yeah, Ocon maybe could have been one place higher, but not a massive difference. And a shame for Tsunoda, because he got it into Q3, so he's having a decent weekend, and ends up going away empty-handed. He did eventually retire with the damage from that incident, although he did hang around at the back in that hobbled cart for a while. While we're speaking to you, Scott, about some of these incidents, there was one at the end of the race with the two Aston Martins. Lance Stroll took that final point for 10th ahead of Sebastian Vettel, but we did see that near coming together at the last corner on the last lap. Can you talk us through that one?
Yes, so on the final lap of the race, Vettel had been able to have a go at Stroll because Stroll had fallen out of DRS range from Ricciardo's McLaren. So Vettel forced him to defend into the chicane on the back straight, which then allowed him to obviously have a very good run out of the corner down to Cena and then Bose. Stroll covered the inside line into both those corners. And then he also defended, probably unnecessarily really, into the left-hander that splits Bose in the penultimate corner, which meant Vettel got a great run off that corner. Stroll sort of covered him into the penultimate corner. Vettel took a decent amount of speed through there, and then Stroll went defensive, unsurprisingly, into the final corner, the last overtaking spot on the circuit. His line was he was giving himself a very acute angle to attack the corner. Vettel went wide, unsurprisingly, and then pulled the car back to cut back underneath his teammate. But then Stroll just came right back across Vettel's bows, and Vettel had to get out of the throttle and brake to avoid contact, and he stuck his hand in the air and then basically coasted to the finish line. He was that annoyed. And he said afterwards, he didn't use these exact words, but he said he basically said that Stroll brake tested him. The way Vettel described it was he got on the brake again, which obviously that's brake testing. But Stroll said that wasn't the case, and I actually watched it back a few times. I got hold of some slightly rudimentary throttle and brake traces. There's not actually any evidence that Stroll does get on the brake again, and he doesn't even seem to do a big lift or anything like that. What it looks like he does is he just doesn't get back on the throttle. So by doing that, and then obviously cutting back across as well, angling it really tight on the exit of the corner, it's tantamount to a brake test, because it at least creates the same effect as one. His speed off the corner is nowhere near what Vettel expects it to be. Vettel gets balked, basically, and Stroll keeps the position. So Vettel was very unhappy. That much was very, very clear after the race. Stroll, unsurprisingly, didn't think he did anything wrong. But yeah, it was a close run thing, because Vettel said it didn't really matter at the end of the day because it was still a point for the team. But it wasn't far away from the two of them colliding, and then that Grand Prix and that point, all basically go into waste.
Yeah, that would have been embarrassing, and wouldn't it? But good news for Pierre Gasly in the AlphaTauri, who would have picked up a point, but as it was, he ended up 12th. But Mark, on the subject of AlphaTauri, significant upgrade package for them in France as well. Race wasn't great with Tsunoda's first lap incident and Gasly's struggles. He was eliminated in Q1 as well. The safety car timing played against him as well after he started on hards. Any signs of improvement from AlphaTauri, though?
Yeah, I think the upgrade is giving them a bit more. There were drivers saying it gives a much more positive front end. It's not washing out so much, but it's Gasly's. There seemed to be a particular problem with Gasly's car in qualifying, but when it was working, it was much better. And I think we just circumstances meant we didn't really see the potential of the car in either qualifying or the race. But yeah, Coming back to that Stroll-Vettel incident, Martin Donnelly did exactly that to me in a kart race once. So, yeah, Seb's got my full sympathy.
It's good to see an old grudge getting put into the podcast. That's what we like to hear. Shall we finish off, Scott, on Haas? It's another weekend of frustrated promise, I think we could call it. Kevin Magnussen retired after his clash with Nicholas Latifi, and Mick Schumacher was 15th. Is this a case of Haas sympathy corner again?
Yeah, it is, partly because while obviously this was a better place than Hungary to take an engine-related grid penalty for Magnussen, I don't think they had a choice. Much like when Schumacher's qualifying went awry completely of his own making, despite his protestations that he actually did nothing wrong or nothing different with his corner cut in Q1. It would have made sense for Schumacher to take a new engine. He's at the back of the grid. They've got to work through them at some point anyway. Might as well just do it strategically. This was not an option for either of them because there simply weren't enough Ferrari engines to go around. So I don't think Magnussen could have held on anymore with his previous power unit. I think he needed his new one here, and then because of that, I don't think there was one for Schumacher to take. Which just sent them on a hiding to nothing for the Grand Prix. Schumacher was at the back because of his poor qualifying. Magnussen was at the back because of the grid penalty. They showed that they had very good pace in the car. Magnussen, I don't remember where Magnussen was in Q2, but he was very, very happy with his pace there. Did it pretty much just to show how quick the car was and do a bit of one lap learning. And then early in the Grand Prix, I think they made good progress, but they locked themselves into that two-stop strategy and then got, the safety car timing was really poor for them. And then after that, Magnussen just seemed to be a magnet for people that were slightly out of control, and he had a couple of incidents that were very, very costly. And it was, I don't think it's sympathy corner territory, just because I think it was already looking like a compromised weekend from the beginning. But weekend of frustrated promise, I think that's valid because, well, certainly a weekend of frustrated performance potential, because clearly that car is still good enough for the top 10, but it was just never ever looking like it was on the cards really, save for perhaps a few laps at the very start of the race.
And a big upgrade coming for Haas for this weekend's Hungarian Grand Prix. So that's one to look out for on Friday. That's going to be a big package, and they're relatively confident about it. I have to add on Schumacher and his complaints about the qualifying track cut. I had a look at his fastest laps in each of the 3 practice sessions and the first one in Q1, and in none of them does he cut the corner as much as he did there, because he complained it was unfair that he was getting away with it before and got no warning, and then he got it, but he just went that little bit further, not deliberately, just probably a little bit more grip. Best conditions, had the fresh softs on, pushing to the maximum, and just went that little bit too far, which does happen. But yeah, he wasn't too pleased about that one. We should briefly also mention the Zhou Guanyu penalty, which he got for that moment, which carried him into Kevin Magnussen. Mark, you could in any way defend against that penalty? That one did look like a fairly clear-cut penalty, didn't it?
No, it's a slam dunk. Yeah. No. I've had a word with McLaren tonight. I don't want to put any further words in.
Nothing that may prejudice their case. But yeah, it was an honest mistake from Joe. Had a big snap and it carried him into him, but he wasn't going to get a great result anyway, and in the end did retire. Well, thanks very much to Scott, Mitchell and Mark Hughes for your insight. There's loads to read on therace.com, and don't forget the hyphen, including Mark's race analysis, my driver ratings that will appear on Monday, and Scott's look at Ferrari's wastefulness. Also, check out our YouTube channel, just search for The Race, and our sister podcasts, including Bring Back V10s and The Race F1 Tech Show. We've got one more race to go before the August break, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the Hungarian Grand Prix.